Well, welcome everybody. My name is Mark Walker from AbilityNet. I'm the host of the webinars for AbilityNet. We've got two people you're going to hear from today who I'll introduce to you in a moment, Abi from AbilityNet and Jack. We're going to run through some slides about accessible written content, and we're going to take about 35 to 40 minutes. So, got to click a different way of clicking. Sorry, no, I'm just having a tech moment here. Trying to work out the best way to click. Here we go. So we're going to talk today about accessible written content. So that's all about content that you could write both on the web, but also that you might do in word processing or anywhere else that you're putting content. We're going to cover two main areas. How does layout, design and format affect legibility and readability? Abby's going to talk about that. And then I'm going to introduce you to Jack in a moment, but Jack is going to talk about planning and writing and testing and the actual processes for making sure your content is accessible. Along the way, there'll be lots of top tips and ideas. And at the end, there'll be a question and answer. But please do feel free to use the question and answers as we go along. We want to make this as sort of interactive as possible. And we'd like to engage you in the process as much as we can to make sure you get what you want from the session. So to begin the process, I'm also just going to check that the software is working. I'm going to launch a poll. So you should be able to see a poll. This is just a litmus test really to see who we're talking to. How often do you check the reading age of your written content? And I think one thing is I'm going to check the software is working. The other thing, you're going to give me a steer on the sorts of things that you're already doing. So we've got, I can see that most people have now answered the question. We've got a small number of people for whom it's the workflows every day. And Jack, can you see the poll? I'm just checking because we haven't used this with you before. Oh, you're on mute.
I can see the answers, but I can't see the results.
No, I thought that was the case. So I think the panelists can see the results. So. Okay, so if I pull up the results, I'm hoping you can see this. Share the results with everybody. You'll see what the results are. Majority of people are not checking. Well, not the majority, but the most checked answer is that you're not checking the reading age, that you're rarely checking it. Those two add up to more than 50% of the people who've answered. There's a small number of people who are checking it for every post. So I'm just going to run another poll then, because I'd like to know what your role is. And this will give us an indication of the sorts of ways that we can steer the discussions. So which of the following best describes your role in relation to this webinar? You can choose more than one. Are you a content person, producing, writing? Are you interested in technical details? You may be a web person, a developer, somebody actually running the website that people are using to publish content. You may be a designer. You may have the word accessibility in your role and be an accessibility specialist in your team. You may be managing a comms team. That's the role I'm bringing to this. I'm the marketing and communications manager for our team, so I'm very interested in how our team does this collectively. Or you may be have another role. So choose the best one that fits you, and that will help us steer the discussion. Okay, if anybody, when I see people raising hands, if they have anything that they need some help with, can you use the Q&A? I've got the Q&A open here. So if you could use the Q&A spot, if anybody has any issues that they need any help with, use the Q&A. I'm essentially hosting the event, so I'll try and pick that up once we're into the content. Okay, so I'm going to share the results back with you. And you can see the vast majority of you are, 61% of you are doing some sort of content role, and then the rest, there's a bit in there about website management, design and layout. There's a reasonable amount of you doing that. 30% of people said design and layout. and there's 30% of you say you're an accessibility specialist. So I hope we're not preaching to the choir too much, but hopefully there'll be stuff in here that you'll recognise and things that you won't have seen before. Okay, thank you very much for that. So we've got two people to speak to us today. First person I'd like to introduce you to is Jack. Jack, can you tell us a bit about your role at Scope and the work that you do there?
Yeah, sure. I'm senior content designer at Scope. I work on information advice content for disabled people and their families. That normally means writing content that helps them to make decisions. And we do that by kind of gathering as much evidence as we can as to what the need is, writing it and testing it and iterating it with the people who need it. And
how long have you been at Scope?
I've been there about 18 months, 2 years in October.
Great. And you worked on a big project, I think. I mean, there's been a big shift going on with Scope, I think, the big digital project. I think that's helpful to know about that.
Yeah, so this is quite a new way of working for Scope. I joined when we were piloting it, so we wanted to adopt a content design approach somewhere that was quite well embedded in government digital, and had been picked up by one or two other larger charities, so Citizens Advice and some social enterprises like Co-op. Yeah, it was a new way of working for Scope. So it started off as a very small team. So it was me, one user researcher and a project manager. And we just did one epic. We looked at employment, work and employment for disabled people and their families. And we trialed that for 6 months. And then that project has gotten larger and we're looking at more and more subject areas. So we're just finishing transport and social care at the moment.
Cool. So, and a primary role of Scope is obviously sharing information to people through the website and other means. So it's a core activity for Scope to publish information.
Yeah, it's a core activity to publish. That the information is also being used across our services. So things like our helpline and our frontline employment services. The idea is they'll be drawing off the same core information for the services as well, of which the website is the primary one. Yeah.
Thank you. Cool. Well, we'll come back to you in a second. The first thing I'd like to do for anybody who hasn't come across AbilityNet before, just tell you a little bit about what we do. We have a variety of services. We help make the digital world accessible to all. So we have digital accessibility services. We do testing and consultancy, training, and other similar agency type services. A whole range of different companies use us. People like Barclays and Lloyds Banking Group, for example, have been customers for several years. We have HE and DSA services. DSA is Disabled Students Allowances. We offer advice to universities, and we also do one-to-one support for individual students when they're eligible. We provide support in the workplace to help disabled people identify the reasonable adjustments that will help them be as productive as possible. We have a network of 300 volunteers who go into people's homes and help them with their IT. And our website has loads of advice, information and resources, including My Computer, My Way, which is a piece of information about all the different adjustments on every computer. We run Tech for Good Awards. Tech for Good Awards are open for entries now. They'll be plugged heavily all the way through the webinar. We also run an IT volunteer conference in June where we work with the RNIB to bring together IT volunteers to share best practice. And we have an event called TechShare Pro that we run in November. It's being hosted by Google this year in London, and that's in the 20th and 21st of November. And we work with the RNIB on that as well. So we work across a range of different organisations, and we have support from a whole host of different partners, including Microsoft, IBM, BT, Google, Barclays, Scope, Lloyds Banking Group, Stroke Association, Samsung, and many more. I've done the poll, so I'm going to just jump into the video. So Abi, unfortunately, she's been slated for this for a long time, and then last week a client asked her to be on site today, and there's no way she could get out of it. So she's an accessibility consultant for AbilityNet, and so I've recorded an interview with her that I'm going to play now. You can still ask questions over the top. Obviously, I can't ask Abi any questions, but I'll try and answer them at the end if you have anything that comes up in this that you want to know more about. So, again, if you can just... okay, so hi, Abi. Can you tell us a bit about your role and how it is connected to accessible content?
Yeah, good morning, Mark. So I've spent about the last 15 years or so working in the assistive technology and accessibility field, and a lot of that work has been focused around helping people with dyslexia, reading difficulties and cognitive difficulties. And one of the key factors with that is making sure that digital content is presented in a format that is readable, but also can be converted and personalised to suit different people's needs, about being flexible as well. So the key areas I wanted to talk about today are fonts and colours, layout and structure.
Cool. So let's start with the first one then. So fonts, what are the top tips for fonts?
So fonts is really a critical one. It's something that seems to really interest designers. When we have websites, we're talking about dyslexia and technology, fonts has always got the biggest hits. And generally, actually, there's a lot to do with familiarity of font, that people like fonts that they are used to reading. But we have got research and a lot of anecdotal evidence that people prefer sans serif fonts if they have a reading difficulty like dyslexia, not the serif fonts. So good examples that are recommended are Arial, Calibri, which is the Microsoft font, Verdana, or if you're looking for an open source font for website, Open Sans is a good one.
Great. I've often heard people talking about dyslexia and specific fonts. It seems from this that you're suggesting that there isn't a great deal of evidence.
Yeah, so part of my role is as an academic researching actually what technology and solutions will help. And when we look at the projects and some experiments where we've tested different fonts with dyslexic readers and non-dyslexic readers, there isn't any evidence that the dyslexia fonts stand out as being much easier to read, and people who are not dyslexic or have any visual difficulties with reading find them really distracting. So again, sans serif fonts like Arial tend to come out best in those experiments. What's actually been shown is that things like word, character and line spacing have a bigger impact. So often with these fonts, one aspect of them is that the letters are all the same size and they're well spaced, but you can get that through many of the open fonts that people can access already. Right.
Thank you. So, and then there's plenty of other top tips that you've got here for layout considerations. Do you want to run through those for us?
Yeah, so I've just sort of summarised a few of the other recommendations we use. One of the things is avoiding all capitals. Some people with reading difficulties will look at the shape of the word and try and recognise that if they have problems actually breaking down the word into the phonemes and understanding it. So we recommend using sentence case, avoiding all capitals. That also affects people who listen to text, either with screen readers or text to speech, because the actual phrasing of the voice changes if you're using capitals. Essentially, it's shouting. We recommend using 12 to 14 point font size, but be aware that font sizes are not equal. Depending on which font you choose. So some fonts will still look very small at 12 points, but try to get to 12 or 14 points at the website equivalent if you can. Underline and italics can also get in the way of reading. Essentially, underline, it's breaking up the shape of the word. Italics, the letter spacing gets affected. So if you do want to use some form of emphasis, bold is the best way to do it. As I mentioned, paragraph and line spacing and word spacing are the things that can really have an effect on readability. And generally, with line spacing, we found about 1.2 to 1.5 is the best level of line spacing to head for. Double line spacing is too spaced, and people get distracted.
Sorry, just to check in, you're primarily referring to print-related measures there, point and other things. So do you have the equivalents if you were doing CSS stuff? Do you work with people on that?
Yeah, you can calculate the CSS equivalent. So you can go up to PX or your emphasize. So on website design, you tend to set a baseline font size for your website, and then everything sort of scales up from there. So again, and we tend to think of large print as being 18 px or bigger. So sort of aiming for sort of 16 as your base font is a good level to go for. One of the other things which is more to do with writing is trying to use bullet points and break down long sentences into concise points. Helps everybody with readability. It means we can sort of see the important points quickly. And then another thing to do with layout is there's been some projects where people have looked at how people are reading using eye tracking software, and they found that using long lines, particularly with wide screens, can be difficult for people who have reading difficulties. So keeping sort of a central column, shorter lines can help people tracking the text as well. It also helps with website design because it means that your site works on many different sizes of screens. And left justified text, again, also helps people track back to the beginning of the lines. That can also help as well.
Great. And I noticed often on columns as well, just as a side, often if you're trying to read a PDF on your screen, you have to go to the bottom of the screen and all the way back up to the top again. You know, so you load up a page in 2 columns.
That's it. And also, if you're doing that on a tablet or a mobile phone, you're having to scroll backwards and forwards. It doesn't reflow. So anything with columns really affects people who are having to change the font size and zooming, because it's not going to actually reflow into one column for them. So thinking about just designing it all in one column is better for everybody.
Right.
Colours. Now, colours is another area people are aware of. It can affect readability. And for people with visual impairment, they're often trying to make high contrast between the background and foreground. But people who have who get tired eyes or have some visual sensitivity where the text can move on the screen actually want a lower contrast between the background and foreground. Again, research-wise, it's a bit mixed. People say, is this actually a true factor? But when we talk to many people who have reading difficulties, there tends to be sort of some evidence that they prefer either pale blue, cream backgrounds with black text, or also sort of pale pink and pale green are also popular, but the creams and the blues tend to be the ones that stand out. And generally, also, the general population are quite happy with cream or very pale grey backgrounds as well, as that's something they are more familiar with, cream paper being quite common in some areas. So think about the background colour you're choosing. You still have to make sure that there is sufficient contrast between the background and foreground colours, but off-white moving towards cream also can help people with readability as well. Yeah, well, this is just a summary really of those points that I've made. So think about line spacing, length and justification, altering the font size and style, colour overlays, background and paper. So those are the types of things that can affect readability. And there's just a link there if people wanted to access the British Dyslexia Association style guide, which has been based on this research. So it summarises many aspects of how you can make dyslexia friendly text, both for print and online text as well.
Great. And you're referring to the Dyslexia Association. Have they done lots of research as well behind it? You mentioned research. Is dyslexia the primary interest that people have in researching this stuff?
Yes, it's one area where there are lots of projects that go on around the world, and the BDA Style Guide has been around for 20 years, and I've been involved in it evolving over time. And last year in 2018, we went and looked at all the literature that was available based on the recommendations that had been made previously, and updated the guide to represent the latest research findings.
Great. So I think you've got an example here of a very unreadable text.
So really this is just sort of putting all that advice into context. 4 examples on the screen, just to show you. Obviously the top right example has low contrast and it's green on red, which also affects people with colour blindness, and it's italic, so pretty much I can't read that at all. The top left is good contrast but capitals, so you can't really see necessarily where the sentences start. The bold is not as clear as well. And the bottom left is 2 columns, but it's also justified text, so we get this what we call rivers of white space, big gaps between words, so it's very difficult to see where the column starts and finish. And the bottom right hand corner, cream background, clear sans serif font, and easy to read text. And if we just move on, we'll see 2 other examples of how that could be laid out. So in the top box. We've got with a larger line spacing as well, but with a wide column. So you can see that it's very clear to see each line of text, and a narrower column in the bottom box. So there are options of how you lay out the text, but hopefully that shows sort of how much impact this can have.
And just to finally, in terms of people you're working with, do you typically work with the people writing and producing the content, or are you much more involved with the designers? Because I'm just thinking some people won't have any way of controlling this on their website. Some CMSs allow that.
I think it essentially, with accessibility, it's content writers and designers. It's two different separate roles. Designers can set up templates. They can set up how the content is laid out on the page, the width of the lines, the colors. That's all done at a sort of often at a site level in the templates. But then with the content people, it's also about how they use emphasis, how they use headings, how they use bullet points. So if we just move on to the next slide, thinking about structure and headings is really important. Break up text with headings so people can scan through and see what's on the page very quickly. And use font size and bold to discriminate, not underline or capitals. So taking those pointers that we've just talked about readability. But the other critical factor, and one we really still see so much, is using styles either in Word documents or PowerPoint or equivalent, and also on the web using heading tags to actually apply the semantics behind the text that's just on the screen, because that helps people with screen readers because they can navigate by headings, but also people who can see. There's lots of widgets available where you can get an outline view, or you can also see it within Word and things. So it means that you can jump, you can see that summary. It also means that if they change the look of the document, they change the fonts, they change the colors, which a lot of people do, including myself. I'm forever taking Times New Roman off any documents I receive. The headings are still maintained. If you just use formatting, bold, change the font size, that will all be lost. So all that hard work you've done is lost if you don't use the actual technology behind the text to apply your semantics and structure.
Right. And I know, because I had a look when we were doing this, that there's a lot of helpful advice about using style guides and style sheets in Word in particular. And I always struck, I did desktop publishing as probably the first thing I did in terms of using a computer. And it's all about hierarchies and heading styles. Yeah. And it's been built into Word for years, but
absolutely,
people don't realize it's there. But it really does help the way you write as well, I think.
Absolutely. And also I'd say, if you're also thinking, well, actually I'm producing PDFs, that structure's all in PDFs, and the easiest way to create an accessible PDF is to start with Word, create an accessible Word document, use the accessibility checker, and then when you export it, make sure the headings are being exported as tags and as bookmarks as well, and all that is built in as well. And there's some very easy tools as well online to check headings. When you're checking on a website, any accessibility checker will show you if you've got a heading structure correctly.
Great, thanks. Well, thanks for that, Abby. That's brilliant. And I think what we can see here is that there's a lot of very simple things you can do at every stage, and just to make the content more readable and accessible. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Great, thanks everyone. Thank you, Abby. I can't thank her in person, obviously. So let's get back over to the slides. I just need to close this. Why can't I close the video? I can't make the video go away, sorry. I seem to have lost my video control. Here we go. So I have to apologise. Firstly, I managed to cover up the chat box when I played the video. We don't normally have videos on these, so I didn't realise that was going to happen. So I've got some chat here, and I know that there's been some questions about the poll. I think that the problem with the poll is that the content on the web page, when you're viewing this as a browser, won't necessarily appear. I'm not sure whether you could vote or whether you couldn't vote, but I think there's an issue there around how you've actually accessed it. And I just apologise. I didn't have the the chat enabled, so I couldn't respond to that immediately. I can also see there's a lot of questions on there that I'll try and come to. So I just want to pick up a couple that came through that somebody mentioned about what Abi had said. Obviously, Abi's not here to reply, but I'll just pick a couple to say, just to show that you can ask some questions, and we'll do Q&A at the end as well. Firstly, do you recommend left-aligned or central-aligned text on websites? It was clear from Abi that left-aligned is the first choice. You can use centered text. Sometimes that's helpful for highlighting something. But we've just been through some stuff on our website, and we moved everything to left-aligned absolutely as far as possible, and that was for readability and accessibility purposes. And then also, how does choosing the color of how does choosing one of those colors affect people who want to change the background color themselves? There are lots of places where people can change the background color themselves. You may make that fine. You may make that option available on your website, or it may be that they use their browser, or it may be that they're using Word, for example. You can set up colors within your Office documents to make them more readable. Typically, you can see I made the background color of the slides you're looking at slightly off-white. One thing I hadn't spotted before that Abi mentioned is that some people prefer not to have too much contrast, that you do need to create a contrast between the foreground and background color, but too much black on white can actually get tiring and be difficult for people to read, and hence the slightly softer color improves that readability. So that's a couple of things I've picked up. I'm going to go through the chat. I'm going to introduce you to Jack and then go through the chat and see what else I missed. So apologies for that. Not picking up on that sooner. So Jack, hello. We've introduced you. There's a nice cheery photograph of you. I'm going to let you crack on with your slides. Have you got control of the machine? Just checking the technology's working.
Let's see where we are.
Click and see if you get the next one. There we go. I'll leave that to you.
Lovely. Yeah, so you've already heard about where I work and maybe what I do. We at Scope, we have quite a functional definition of what accessible content is. That is that people can understand it with as little effort as possible. When they're trying to solve a problem, that they can find it. And we, in order to do that, we try to make sure each bit of content we produce addresses a real need, and that we use the same language that our users use. Today, I'm going to talk about, in the context of accessible content, team culture, planning content with data, writing tools, how to get feedback, and how to do just enough testing to get kind of a high value in terms of your return on investment of effort, which I'm calling just enough testing. Let's move slides if we can. I might jump to. I don't appear to have control. Or maybe, I do, and I'm jumping all over the shop.
I'll change it, Jack. I think that's probably, we're a little bit unsure about the technology there. So
fair play. So can I have team culture, please?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So culture is shared ideas of ways of working. That could be really grand things like how you include people, the kinds of conversations you have, and how you influence people. Standards can be a really big part of this, and there are standards up there for you to borrow or steal. So thinking about things like the Government Digital Service, Citizens Advice have published some great stuff, and there's a really great ongoing project led by Content Design London called the Readability Guidelines Project, where they're pooling all the evidence and usability studies in relation to content into one place in a wiki that people can go in and edit. And I think Lizzie Bruce, who is organising that, is with us today. So hello, Lizzie. I'm really glad you could make it.
Jack, are you able to move your microphone very slightly? People are saying it's a little bit quiet.
I can. Is that any better for people?
That's certainly better for me. Yeah, thank you.
Smashing. Okay, can we move on, please, Mark? We talk about planning content with data. So the goal is to have each individual piece of content a solution to a real world problem that's relevant and easy to use. Sarah Richards talked about being able to feel the be able to see and feel the edges of the piece of content you're writing. That's really important, because the temptation is we're driven to help people, and that can drive us to throw in anything that's relevant to a piece of content, but what's relevant isn't always useful. So having clearly defined edges to the problem you're trying to solve really helps, and the way to do that is to ground the content you're planning in data. Fortunately, there's a whole heap of methods from the UX research world to borrow from and adapt. So that usually looks like writing user or job stories, which we're going to talk about more in a bit, before you start writing your content, and to maybe bolster those up with acceptance criteria. So those are two tools you use to articulate the problem you're trying to solve, which will help your content to be easier to understand and test. Next slide, please, Mark. So this is a job story or a job story template. It's basically a brief, which is, I'm sure, something that anyone who's commissioned any content is familiar with. It's just a really, really lightweight one. And it starts, a job story starts with a when trigger. And then move on to the real world goal, the problem someone is trying to solve. So the effect they want to see in the real world. And then you have an I want to statement, which tells you about how the user thinks they need to solve their problem. Sometimes that is the best way to do it, and sometimes it isn't, but it always tells you something about the way they think. And that's really, really helpful when you're planning how to structure something. And the as a statement, which the people often get very hung up on demographics and try to cram a lot of data in there, but actually the only things you need to include are the things which are relevant to the problem that you're trying to solve. So if we're writing a piece on employment, for example, at Scope, and it's about applying for jobs, how you do that might be really different depending on if you've had a job before or if you haven't had a job before. So things like that, and you'll be able to hone in on what those data points are, kind of the more research you do. So if we could skip on to the next slide, Mark, we've got an example job story.
There we go.
Yep. So here we've got when I can't work full time so that I can work and manage my condition, I want to find flexible and part-time work as a disabled person. That the when trigger in that story is quite light. Someone could find out they can't work full-time after kind of quite a catastrophic event in their lives, or it could be quite a slow kind of build up over time. You'd probably have to cater to both of those. So if I had my time again, I might work both of those into the job story. But there's an example. I'm happy to share other ones with people if they're interested. Okay, next slide, please, Mark. So we're big on feedback at Scope. And the quicker you can get it back, the better. One of the quickest ways you can do that is to use tools that provide feedback as you write. One of those is Hemingway, which is a browser-based and a desktop app content editor, which gives you feedback on the complexity of what you're writing. It does give you a reading age. We do have a reading age we aim for in Scope. It's quite low. People often ask me kind of what it is, and my somewhat facetious answer is probably lower than you think it should be. I think the average reading age in the UK is something like 9 years old. So your audience may not be 9 years old, but there will be people for whom that is their reading age. And even if it's not, if you're using words that are part of someone's core vocabulary, which is to say the words they use most every day, it's going to be much easier for them to read. You're going to have to expend much less effort. So I I call that the drop curb effect from language. There are some people who specifically need drop curbs, but we all benefit. And similarly, if you make your content as easy and as fast to read as possible, then you open that up to more people, regardless of their reading age. Citizens Advice have actually made their own content checker as a plugin for Google Docs, and they've blogged about that, which is really, really exciting stuff. So when they get insights from their research about content that does or patterns of content that do and don't work, or words that do and don't work, they can flag those in their editor. Another tool we use is pair writing. So where we have a content person and a subject expert who will write a piece of content together. We found that really helpful. It avoids pinging drafts between each other, and it's one way of solving the problem where if you know enough to say that something is correct, you probably don't know it, aren't able to check if it's clear for a person who's new to the subject, and pair writing is one of the tools you can use to solve that problem. We do that on all our information and advice content at Scope.
And Jack, who do you involve in the pairs? Is that typically just writers in similar roles, or do you mix it up? I know we're coming to some sort of stuff, but just the pairs particularly.
Yeah, so at Scope, the way we do that is we have one content person, so one content designer and one subject expert. They will, that subject expert could be a member of staff. Sometimes we don't have that expertise in-house and we have to hire someone. And an awful lot of our work actually it involves kind of keeping that roster up to date and nurturing those relationships, getting people kind of integrated into the way of working, because it is quite collaborative, and most people enjoy it, but it's normally the first time people have done something like that. So during those sessions, we'll sit in front of a job story and acceptance criteria, and sometimes, we vary in what we go in with. I go in with enough information to ask what I hope are intelligent questions. I have peers here who they like to go in with a first draft, and there are different ways of solving the same problem. But the idea is you leave that session with something that is maybe rough, possibly even very rough notes, but the subject expert agrees is correct. And then the content designer can go away and refine that into something that looks more like a finished piece, a first draft.
Great, thank you. And that leads on to this point, I guess, that the good feedback from anybody when you're doing writing is structured in some way.
Yeah, thank you. It does. If feedback's a hard one, it can be if you get the feedback you weren't expecting, or it's the kind of feedback you weren't expecting, it can be quite soul-crushing, as I'm sure some of our audience knows. The best safeguard for that is to let people know the kind of feedback you're in the market for. And we've kind of building on the work of other people, principally the Government Digital Service, GDS, we've made that part of our workflow in the form of crits, which are basically feedback workshops, and in which we're going to talk more about on the next slide. The goal, and I love crits, they're really collaborative, exciting spaces. The point of a crit is not to have a crit, it's to avoid sign-off and to avoid track changes, which actually people kind of think as a sort of governance-y, management-y type thing, but like the seeds of inaccessible content can be sown in your feedback process if you get something which is appended or complicated with lots of legalese, because that's how your sign-off process works, and your content could well become inaccessible very, very quickly. So yeah, these are the roles, the defined roles we have in our crits at Scope. The content designer who wrote the piece is in there and chairs the crit. The There's another content person in there with an editorial role who is there to advocate for plain English, be a second pair of eyes, and to make sure that we stick to the style guide. We have the subject expert who is in there to fact check the content that we write. And the user researcher who advocates for the user need and the context in which that need lives. And people can step outside their role, but fortunately, if they step out of their role, they're normally stepping into someone else's. So that's a quite neat way of kind of avoiding disputes or disagreements, in that sometimes a subject expert will have an opinion about how something should be phrased, and I can, as chair, I can remain neutral and say something like, "That's really interesting, Alex, our editor. What do you think?" And it diffuses the situation in kind of quite a neutral way. You can do this in lots of ways. We run ours over Google Docs and using Skype, but which means that we can be anywhere. If you're fortunate enough to have a team that's all in one place, that can work really well too. People here have the opportunity to comment against the Google Doc ahead of time, so that we know that not everyone is massively extroverted, and some people like to think quietly and leave their points there. Ahead of time. You could replicate that by giving people post-it notes to stick against a piece of content if you're doing it in the room. Yeah, and that's what our crits look like. Thank you, Mark. That's the right time to move on. Doing a bit of testing can go a really long way to helping your content be accessible. All the things we talked about are important, like aiming for a reading age is important. Using good semantic structured headings are important. You can do all those things and still end up with something that is hard to read and understand. Similarly, to kind of draw parallels with the web world, the web development world, you could develop something that was totally WCAG compliant, but it's really hard to use. Accessibility is usability with a plus inclusive design. So if you do some testing with the people the content is for, that is one of the main tools you can use to check that something is accessible. We do a variation on what we call highlighter testing. We read content and we ask people to highlight the things that they like, to highlight the things that they find hard to understand or disagree with, or to tell us things that are missing. That can be a paper-led exercise, or you can do it directly onto Google Docs, which makes it easy to share. You can do that remotely or in person. The advantage of doing it remotely is you can reach a much more diverse range of people. We were doing in-person paper testing during the pilot phase of the project, which was great. You got lots of really rich feedback from people. You could see people underlining stuff or hesitating, thinking about underlining something and then skipping it, and you could say, hang on, what was going on for you there? The disadvantage of that is that we limited ourselves to people who could get to Zone 2 in London during working hours, which was obviously a very self-selecting group of people. And for some people that was fine. We were testing a lot of content that was for people who were seeking work. But when we moved on to other topics, we felt like we had to diversify in order to get a better spread of people to do that. And testing a piece of content with between 2 and 5 people will go a long way. We're really lucky at Scope. We have people to help us recruit participants who fit a certain profile. And I'm aware that not everyone has those kind of resources. If you are really stuck, then just someone who is not the person who wrote the content will provide some value to you. Ideally, someone who doesn't work for your organization at all. And if you have any kind of customer-facing function at the organisation you work, just go and hang out with them and see if you can intercept some customers to see if they'll test your content. Okay, I think I'm ready to move on.
So I'm going to do this quickly, Jack, just because we've asked, lots of people have been asking about links. So within the document that we're using today, the PowerPoint will be shared, and the links may work when we post them. We put them on SlideShare and on our website, but we'll also be producing a list of links, so that will be followed up in the follow-up. So there is a lot of stuff you've referenced there, which I just wanted to reassure people will be available afterwards. So. And finally, so I've firstly got to say, Jack, that was fantastic. There's a few comments coming in, and I just wanted to underline something that, as you said at the end, this is something that you're doing in an organisation that's got a reasonably sized team working on a range of different roles, trying to publish a huge amount of content. We've got some people saying, obviously, as you said, I don't have as much a resource available, or it's not something that I'm doing in quite the same way. I think what's useful to point out is that a lot of the links that you can pick up through Jack's talk will guide you to something which is useful to you. But the first thing to start with, probably is the last thing, is that the testing is one of the most valuable things that you can do, I think. And involving people in the process, which is what your structure does. That crit, I think, is an amazing way of bringing in a very structured way lots of different feedback from different people. When you're just sat there on your own and you're trying to do this for yourself on your own website in a small voluntary organisation, obviously that feels less relevant, but it's still important to realise that you'll get a lot of help by engaging with other people, and that's part of making it accessible. They don't necessarily have to provide you with insights because they have a particular disability. They may just help you just tease out and make your reading, your content more inclusive. And that inclusive means that you can put it in front of somebody and they can understand what you're trying to say without sort of getting in the way of jargon and all the other stuff that often people find difficult with content. So I think for me, that's a big takeaway, that the testing, whatever format it's in, gives you that starting point for thinking about how you're going to publish something that make it more accessible. I'm going to switch to questions and answers. We've got about, just looking at the time, we'll try and finish at 12, so about 10 minutes. I've got a few things. I'm just going to scroll back through. Firstly, somebody asked about underlining, and Abi mentioned this in her notes. She suggested that underlining wasn't a good way of highlighting content. I've just noticed, actually, if I click back, you can see we've got a lot of underlined text on the previous slide. There is obviously sometimes a conflict between the advice. One of the points about linking, putting links on the page, is you can tell that these are links, and sometimes there's a visual language that you're using. I think the point would be that if you underlined the whole of a page full of text, it would make it unreadable very quickly. She was also, I think, the thing that I picked up on was that if you're going to emphasize some words, use bold, because it doesn't change the shape of the letters as much as underline. So this one, that's where there's a sort of slight conflict there potentially, but this one is using underlining to say, I'm a link, you can click on me, you'll find something useful. The bold is saying, I'm trying to emphasize this point, and I'm not going to italicize it, I'm not going to underline it.
Yeah, I think I chip in and say bold is what you should do if you have to highlight something, but it's probably preferable to highlight something by structuring your document in a way that it stands out on its own. So if something's really important, put it in a subhead. But yeah, if you do end up in a corner where you have to highlight some body text, but bold is a better tool than italics.
Great. Also, I can confirm we're recording this and we're going to share it. Hopefully I've mentioned that a couple of times. We are going to share it afterwards, and all the links that we have in here will be shared as well, and any other feedback that we get through here. If there's stuff you think we've missed, please do add it to us and pass that through to us in the chat box or on the Q&A, and we'll include that as links, because I know there's lots of resources out there that people find useful in different ways. And yes, the recording we share will be shared on YouTube and we'll have captions, so you have to be able to watch it through captions. If we can, we'll burn the captions in. We're looking at ways of doing that on a longer recording. So that will be captioned, but it may be that they're captioned on YouTube and you have to watch them on YouTube. I know some people find that difficult, but that's the way we're doing it next. So there's a few questions here. Are there any predefined standards for creating content on social media? I think there are variation accessibility features in each platform, Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm just going to pick up on something just to jump back. I think there's three things that I want to mention in terms of written content, which just highlight the differences in how you can make content accessible. And also, I think my sort of finishing point would be that there's some rules here that you need to know about, and then there's some stuff that you just need to practice. And the best example I can give you is a lifetime's work on alt text, trying to make alt text work well. We actually have a session that we've run separately about writing good alt text. It's a skill in its own way. It's about practice. So alt text is what you add to an image so that a screen reader will read it back to you. So for people who are, particularly people with visual impairment using a web page, they'll have a screen reader reading to them. And when it hits a picture, it will try and tell you something about the picture. And that information comes from the alt text, the alternative text that's supplied. Now, there's various ways you can add alt text. But if you're using a standard website builder, there should almost certainly be some way of adding alt text. The first thing is to remember that it's there and to use it. The other content is that you can then consider whether it's decorative or whether you do need to explain what's in the image. And we did some work recently on our website, and I was struck by the advice I was getting from our accessibility specialists was often that you've over-egged the alt text because actually it's obvious within the content what it is that image is trying to say, and that it's purely decorative, really. It's just another way of saying the same thing. So if you want to make alt text decorative, if you want to say this image, you don't need to know what's in this image. You just put open inverted commas, close inverted commas as your alt text, and the screen reader just ignores it. So there's a good example of making content accessible. Doesn't mean that you absolutely have to describe every image in every possible way. Sometimes actually turning off the description is going to make it easier for somebody to consume it and not need to read as much content. Got a few people in here offering advice on the chat on that in the Q&A there, and that's very helpful. I'll see if I can catch up on that in a moment. Another one I wanted to mention was link text. The classic don't do is when you see a whole sentence written down and right at the end it says here underlined. And if you were using a screen reader, then often you're going to jump through content looking for links to find out where that content could take you. And that's going to read out that link text. And if you simply write the word here and underline it with a link, then that's the only thing that screen reader is going to hear and read out. So it's better to start by putting a link in that you would actually be able to read out. So for example, find our example of our guidelines here. I don't think you need the here, but that's a matter of styling. Some people prefer to put that in, some don't. But the fact is that you could read that link out and it would make sense and it would take you somewhere, even if you didn't have the previous words in the sentence. So that's a very simple one, and link text just needs to be self-explanatory as you're typing it into your document, and then you underline it and link it out to the web page. There's a few questions about reading age. This has been mentioned a couple of times. Probably the thing to say is that it is perfectly acceptable for your reading age to be well above what the average is, depending on what your audience is. I think the point about making your content accessible is that it should be something that you can see that's appropriate to your audience. But the point that Jack made is that the average reading age is actually possibly lower than you expect. Accessibility tools like Office Accessibility Checker will include reading as well. So you can use the reading age as a guide. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're working to an absolute figure. Just be aware that it's a thing. And then my final top tip is you might not realize how many accessibility features are built into Office now. This is relatively recent, so people won't necessarily have seen this, but all of the core Office tools have an accessibility checker in them. It will be in the ribbon. It will be somewhere within the process of actually creating the documents in the first place, is that you can use the checkers that are built into Word. And one of the things in there is a reading age checker. It will give you some indication of the complexity of the content, and it'll also do a grammar checking for you. So don't forget that those tools that you're building your content in, you could write your content in Word and then import it into your website, and you'll get all of those checking tools in that beforehand. Similarly to the tool that Jack suggested, which was Hemingway, which is freely available, and equally has lots of helpful tips that it's guiding you on as you're producing content. So a couple of questions here. There's some stuff about, can you use the open brackets and close brackets for Twitter image? I'm not going to guess because I don't know the answer specifically for Twitter. So Twitter, Facebook, and other social media platforms do have alt text in them. They all behave slightly differently. Facebook will attempt to give you automatic alt text if you don't have any, and Twitter does have some tools for putting it in, and I think that you need to look at the tools themselves at Twitter or Facebook or whatever. They will have some guidance on that, but they do vary across them. So somebody's just saying, can I clarify about the link text? If you imagine reading the text that you've written in a sentence, if you imagine reading just the link, does it make sense? Does it say, we have a video which you can watch about this topic, rather than video link here, which would tell you nothing about the video that you're going to, or the fact that it's even in the context of the sentence. So just make sure they stand alone. The worst case scenario is when you just put here, the word click here, then that's the worst because it just says here. It doesn't tell you anything about what you're going to or what it is. And just think about it as the opposite of that. Make it clear and make it readable. A couple of bits more here. So it says somebody's pointed out that Twitter leaves alt text blank by default. I don't know if that's the same as leaving it as decorative. I don't know if anybody can tell me that, but I don't think it is. I think that leaving it blank means it will still be read, or will say that it's an image and read out image in the voice over stuff in the JAWS, and for example. Okay, so can you tell me more about how to use infographics? What's the best approach to making infographics accessible? I think, unfortunately, that's a very different topic because it's much more about the use of graphics. I have seen workshops about that. I don't know we've ever run anything about that. Perhaps we can consider that for the future, but I would suspect that's very different. What we're talking about here, I think, is the written word, making sure that you're considering the issues we're talking about, the nature of the text you're writing, and the reading age and so on. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. It's 11:59. Jack, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we've covered so much. I'm not surprised that the chat is still active. The questions are still coming in. I'll do my best to round those up, and we'll provide some feedback information after the event, including all the slides and a video recording and all the other stuff. So I hope you found this useful. I just want to finish with a couple of extra things. What's next? We're going to share the recording and the blog post. We have a webinar next week about tech tips for people with Parkinson's. You can sign up for that on our website. Entries are open for the Tech for Good Awards. That's at techforgoodawards.com. And we do training like this, and we can provide training to particularly in-house teams and others around any range of accessibility issues. So if that's of interest, please do let us know. We will continue to have free webinars as well, but we can also provide paid for training if that's of interest to you. So thank you everyone for joining us, and look forward to seeing you soon on the next webinar.